We were somehow fascinated by the idea that public space is not a simple thing, it's a contested site for confrontation, appropriation, and debate, and we thought that it was in the mission of the CCA, dealing with architecture in the city, to facilitate the conversation and discussion around what public space is today, how that can be engaged with a multiplicity of actors, positions, and activities, and didn't really did much. It was very much on the enthusiasm, capacity, and participation of Concordia that this event of tonight is possible. So thank you again for having thought of us as a partner, and welcome for tonight's speech. And if you want to have parties, you should also come back next week, the same day, Thursday. We have an opening of the new exhibition that is dealing with the photography of the city, the Arab city in the 19th century, a very historical exhibition, but we will have our typical and traditional DJ and drinks alongside a more proper lecture. Maybe it's a good way to continue to fight the cold. Thank you also for having gotten out of where you were to cross the city with minus 20 something and to be here for the lecture. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shelley Butler, and I am the acting director for the Center for Ethnographic Research and Exhibition in the Aftermath of Violence, which is at Concordia University. And it's my pleasure to MC tonight the third event of the 21st consecutive season of the Concordia University Community Lecture Series on HIV and AIDS. Welcome to all students, faculty, community, volunteers, and members of the public. The Concordia HIV/AIDS project takes as its mandate to reach not only the diverse Concordia University, but also the greater Montreal public. Also to maintain a permanent space for interdisciplinary dialogue and research on HIV/AIDS in the region. To address the diverse Concordia University community and the general Montreal public through our university forum. To challenge the Academy to confront the societal crisis engendered by HIV/AIDS and to expand its educational mission. To develop awareness of social, scientific, and cultural aspects of the pandemic through community education, internal dialogue in the Academy, social criticism, and the encouragement of volunteering and activism. To nurture the next generation of HIV/AIDS researchers, activists, and teachers within today's student population. A small, modest mandate. I'm pleased to be here as part of SERA, who has co-sponsored an exciting workshop with tonight's speaker as part of our mandate. At SERA, we often think about curating in terms of caring for, the Latin root of the word, to care for objects and artifacts and stories and histories. And I recognize that that's a very important part of Avram's work, but as I've gotten to know your work a little more, I've been thinking about another aspect of curating in the work you which is struggling for and fighting for, the right to curate and the right to take public space and claim it. And I'm really glad that this event is taking place here at CERAV and also here at CCA and also at CERAV tomorrow. And I'm very excited for CERAV tomorrow. At that center, we're very interested in public scholarship. And to have someone come in who's so activist and practice-oriented, who will actually complete a product with us, with a group of community members, and complete an art project in response to a pressing social issue of criminalization and stigmatization in one day, I think is a really great model for the Academy. So thank you in advance. Before the screening begins, some thank yous are in order. Sorry. We'd like to thank our sponsors, without whom this evening would not be possible. Our principal sponsor, Vive Healthcare, the Office of the President of Concordia University, CERAV, and the following Concordia University departments: Department of Art History, Applied Human Sciences, Religion, the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, Sociology and Anthropology, School of Community and Public Affairs, Studio Arts, Theater, Journalism, Psychology, the Mel Hoppenheim School of Cinema, and Concordia University Office of Institutional Relations. So clearly it takes a village to make this happen, and clearly a lot of hard work has gone into making this happen. Let me just explain the schedule for this evening. We'll have our presentation by our speaker, will be roughly an hour. That will be followed by a question period of 30 to 40 minutes. If you want to ask a question, we'll ask you to raise your hand, and one of the volunteers will come to you with a roaming mic. And you can ask your question in either French or English, and I will, if it's in French, I'll translate it to the audience. And the only other instructions for the evening are to turn off your cell phones for the duration of the presentation. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the person who will introduce Avram. This is Ryan Conrad, is an activist, artist, and scholar from a mill town in central Maine, whose work focuses on the intersections between radical queer politics, affect, and the history of HIV/AIDS activism and art. He's currently a PhD candidate in the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture's Humanities Doctoral Program at Concordia University. Thank you. Ryan.
Thanks for coming, everyone. So I'm going to just give a very quick introduction, sort of giving you some nuts and bolts background about Avram, and then I'm going to do a little bit of context setting for this lecture tonight. So Avram Finkelstein is an artist and writer living in Brooklyn, and his work has shown at the Whitney Museum, the Cooper Hewitt Museum, Kunsthalle Wien, the Harbor Gallery, Exit Art, Sue Scott Gallery, Monroe Gallery, La Mama La Galleria, and the Leslie Lohman Museum. He's also in the permanent collections of the MoMA, the Whitney, the Metropolitan Museum, the New Museum, the Smithsonian, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Victoria and Albert Museum, as well as the New York Public Library. So quite accomplished. Finkelstein is also the founding member of the collective responsible for Silence Equals Death and AIDSgate, which both were recently included in Regarding Warhol's 60 Artists, 50 Years at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. He's also a founding member of the art collective Gran Fury, with whom he collaborated on public art projects for international institutions, including, again, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Venice Biennale, Art Forum, MoCA LA, the New Museum of Contemporary Art, Creative Time, and the Public Art Fund. The collective had its first retrospective at 80 Washington Square East in 2012, and they have work in the permanent collection at the Whitney, the MoMA, the New Museum, and the New York Public Library. Finkelstein has also been interviewed about art in the public sphere by international publications, including the New York Times, Frieze, Art Forum, Bomb, Interview in the Boston Globe, and for multiple film and oral history projects, including Let the Record Show, Silence Opens Doors, and the Active Oral History Project. He's also a contributing culture writer for Artwrit and Critical Mob, and has produced art and cultural features in Italian Vogue, Dazed and Confused, Visionaire, Van, Dune, New York Arts Magazine, Pride, and Genre. Finkelstein has been invited to speak about art, political activism, AIDS activism, LGBT politics, LGBT cultural production, the American left, and art and intellectual property by Harvard, Columbia, NYU, RISD, Mass Art, the School of Visual Arts, CUNY, UMass, the Arts and Labor Working Group of Occupy Wall Street, and now here at the 21st Annual HIV/AIDS Lecture Series at Concordia. So Finkelstein's lecture comes to us at a particular moment worth noting. He recently observed on Artwrit that, quote, "It is likely we're now witnessing the solidification of the history of AIDS," end quote. This is in reference to the recent art retrospectives like the Gran Fury Read My Lips exhibition at NYU in 2012, as well as Harvard's 2009 ACT UP New York, Activism, Art, and the AIDS Crisis, 1987 to 1993, as well as the New York Public Library's Why We Fight, Remembering AIDS Activism exhibition, which is currently on display. Additionally, Finkelstein is referencing the solidification or the solidifying of certain AIDS histories through recently released documentaries like the films We Were Here in 2011 and How to Survive a Plague and United in Anger, A History of ACT UP, both in 2012. Responding to this moment as part of AIDS Action Now's Poster Virus project, Montreal-born artist Vincent Chevalier and Montreal-based history scholar Ian Bradley Perrin both created a poster challenging the ways in which we might be positioned, looking backwards at the history of AIDS activism while neglecting the needs of HIV-positive people today. The catchphrase, "Your nostalgia is killing me," appears alongside images of AIDS activist art adorning bedroom walls on this poster. And it created quite a mean-spirited uproar online for those who witnessed that. And it was particularly mean amongst veteran AIDS activists, I guess, as a way to frame it. So there's a generational disconnect, and it's quite clear. The process of historicization means and does different things to people across generational lines, and the affective divide between the surviving AIDS activist warriors just now being recognized to some degree for their past struggles, and the younger AIDS activists working in their shadow feels largely unbridgeable. This affective generational divide is something I too try to sit with in my work and learn from as an experimental filmmaker, which leads me to ask, or to have an earnest request, if I may, as we make our way through tonight's exciting event. What I ask of us as an intergenerational audience participating in the ongoing project of historicizing HIV and AIDS is that we do so with care for one another. Care for our returning warriors with all their imperfections, but who changed the world and made life livable for young queers like me. And care for our present day POZ warriors who are leading the fights against criminalization, incarceration, austerity, and more. But don't be mistaken. This isn't simply a generic call for niceties, or to water down our much needed critiques of one another's work as we struggle for justice, but a commitment to the radical act of caring for one another as we revisit the glory, the failure, and the trauma of a collective history marked by our own genocide. Because when it comes down to it, what we are calling the canonization of AIDS art and AIDS histories is minimal at best. And the reality is most people, and I would say especially our historians, which is a most conservative discipline of which I'm a part, don't actually care about AIDS, let alone the cultural history or the people directly impacted by the ongoing epidemic. When there are no more bucks to make, and the current wave of academic and art world fascination about HIV/AIDS histories recedes, which it assuredly will as quickly as it has come, we will only have each other to remember and retell our shared histories and to continue the fight against HIV and AIDS. So with that in mind, please help me in welcoming Avram Finkelstein for us tonight.
I didn't realize how dark it was going to be out there. Digital, analog, not really sure how to go. Thank you, Ryan, for that fantastic introduction, my northern comrade. And I wanted to thank both Karen Herland and Ian Bradley Perrin for months of work that it took to get me up here, and to everyone at Concordia and the Concordia Community Lecture Series on HIV/AIDS, and then all the partners in this amazing facility. And tomorrow we're going to make mud pies at the center. It's going to be fantastic. So, and I wanted to thank you, Ian, for warning me about the weather. I think I have the right number of socks on, but I can't really take them off, so if I get hot, I might take my jacket off. So, today I'd like to consider two works closely associated with the early days of AIDS in New York, both of which I had a hand in, one by the Silence Equals Death project, and one by Gran Fury. Sorry, I have to read some notes because I have a tendency to ramble. Although they were conceived of in distinctly different political environments within the canon of cultural production to come out of New York at that moment, they're barely distinguishable in terms of intention and effect, and I'd like to tease that apart a little bit today. I'd like to take that on. But before I do, I'd like to offer a little context and some sort of general ideas to help orient what I'm hoping to share with you. When I went to art school, the phrases fine arts program and master's program were never used in the same breath. So I may have little to offer you today in terms of theory. I will be considering this work mainly from a grassroots organizing perspective, which is why I feel compelled to say that while we prefer to think of art as a reflection of culture that mirrors our higher selves, and frequently it is, art can also be a dividing line. Without access to the education needed to interpret the class codes woven into Western European art, it can be impenetrable, and without the economic mobility that allows us to visit the great museums of the world or to have the leisure time to even go to a museum a few subway stops away, art can easily exceed our reach, and I think sometimes in academic settings we might forget that. So, in my estimation, there can be no discussion about the meaning of art without also considering the institutional walls that surround it. Running parallel to this history, however, is a tradition of art that springs directly from institutional critiques. These are art practices that pierce through the class codes or stand in resistance to them and defy commodification. This is art in the public sphere, practices that activate our social spaces, and art that insists on the deployment of vernaculars. Poster virus. But having been asked about these two works I'm going to be discussing today for over 2 decades, I've come to realize that studying the canon that they belong to does nothing to articulate the urgency of the moment. In fact, I have come to feel that the meaning of the political poster is inadvertently degraded by such consideration. The very process of exploring this work within this setting plays a part in its neutralization. What do I mean by that? When we describe art as a reflection of our culture, it's a gesture that presumes participation in it. As such, it assigns a level of assent, which is fair enough if the goal of the production is cultural to begin with. But posters made during a time of crisis are called to action. They have a very different set of goals. Outside of the realm of our academic consideration, political activism is not cultural production. A community in crisis is not art. So when political posters enter the canon, that undetectable mechanism, the one that implies assent, strips them of their radicalism. That's not to say they can never be explored as artifact. I'm just saying that once the echo of artillery dissipates, all that remains is how we talk about them. And I'm very absorbed in questions about how to do that ethically. The canon that elevates the art of dissent simultaneously domesticizes it by privileging its contribution as cultural production over the more disorderly truths that brought the work into being in the first place. In the end, we get to claim these works as symbols of productivity rather than symbols of resistance. It is defanging. So today I'll be talking about the teeth. As a founding member of the collective that produced Silence Equals Death, I'm often asked to speak about this work, and over its decades, people have thanked me for it and told me that this poster was the rallying cry that drew them to political activism, but I have a very different take on that. In 1991, the man I was building my life around started showing signs of immunosuppression before AIDS even had its name. By 1994, he was dead the year before Rock Hudson was outed by the disease and way before Ronald Reagan, the then president in America, had ever uttered the word. This most private devastation compelled me to articulate my grief in the most public of ways. There's a pathology there I'm not going to comment on. So I formed a collective with two of my friends and proposed we do a poster. I realized that I couldn't be the only one who was enraged. What I discovered, of course, is that I wasn't. I was surrounded by a community that I didn't even realize existed, a community in search of its voice, one that went on to find it through the activation of its social spaces in full view of the world. So we did, in fact, design Silence Equals Death, but I would argue that it was this activist community that created it. This image, as we currently understand it, is a product of collective queer world-making, the sort of collectivity which moves every one of us as individuals and as a culture, and which is transformative. All right, so now let's talk about me. I'm a red diaper baby. My parents were party members. The Rosenbergs came to the utopian colony where we summered. My folks actually met at an international workers' order summer camp that my dad's mom was the chef at. My brother gave me Mao's Red Book when I entered middle school. My grandmother came to anti-war marches with me. When I was 16, I worked for Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign. When I was 17, I canvassed for the Student Mobilization Committee against the war in Vietnam. And I'm such a lefty wonk. My first job was silk screening strike t-shirts. Regardless, to be young in New York in the late 60s was, to be young in the late 60s anywhere was to be political. It was a very pitched political moment. And growing up in New York, the corridor between the East and West Villages in downtown Manhattan were papered with manifestos and meeting announcements and demonstration flyers. And when young people needed to communicate with one another, we used the streets. It was just the way it was. If you lived in New York in 1969, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing anti-war posters like this one by the Art Workers Coalition. In late 1985, shortly after my partner Don died of AIDS, as I said, I started a consciousness-raising group with 5 friends. We met every week, loosely assembled around feminist organizing principles, and we began each session by talking about our fears and anxieties in the age of AIDS, but by the end of every meeting, we were talking about the political storm that was on the horizon. And again, I knew we couldn't be the only ones who saw it, and then I remembered, when New Yorkers need to talk to each other, there's always the street. So I proposed that we do a poster. The primary objective of Silence Equals Death was twofold. The exercise, the problem that I asked the collective to solve was that we had to prompt the community to organize politically around AIDS, and at the exact same time to imply to everyone outside of the community that we already were. In order to speak simultaneously to multiple audiences, the poster would need to rely on what I think of as the adeptness of codes and their unraveling that is peculiar to the queer experience. The cellular predisposition to sifting through our cultural landscape for evidence of ourselves. And in order to sell activism at this somewhat apolitical moment, the poster needed to be cool and to intone knowingness. It needed to be both rarefied and vernacular at the same time. It needed to give the impression of ubiquity to create its own literacy, and it needed to insinuate itself into being. It needed to be advertising. So we consciously decided that we would repaste the poster alongside commercial posters using a professional company to do it, which for some reason people had not, it wasn't a practice at the time. We chose this context to signify an authorized voice and to hint at resources and a level of political organizing that actually didn't exist. The font was graphically on trend. The black background carved its own space in the urban clutter of commercial advertising. And to signal to Manhattan's LGBT communities that the poster was for them, we drew on the historical codes of the pink triangle. It was controversial for us. We went through many images and sort of ended up back at the pink triangle, and we inverted it because we were uncomfortable with the intonation of victimhood of the camps. As an aside, I was very surprised once ACT UP had come into full swing, how many people seemed to agree with the Holocaust analogy when we struggled with it. But of course there were Jews in our collective, so we don't take that sort of thing very lightly. I'm just going to back on this. On the bottom of the poster are 2 lines of running text that are only accessible on intimate encounter. On the one hand, if you're riding by the poster on a bus or a cab and you see the tagline and the image, that sort of draws you in and it's a question mark, but we felt like we needed to actually provide much more information in order to stimulate some level of political thought. So those running lines of modifying text were only really discernible on intimate encounter and were cut off of the later versions of this poster, and some people are unfamiliar with them, which is why I'm calling them out in this context, because I consider it to be an important part of the organizing strategy that went into the poster. And we staged these lines of text in the interrogative to force the audience into Socratic dialogue with the poster. It took us 6 months to finalize this poster. We worked on this one poster for 6 months. We didn't meet all day every day, but it took us 6 months to get what we wanted, to reduce what we wanted to say into these terse one-liners. We pored over press clippings and source material. We studied the work of other collectives like the Guerrilla Girls, who were experts at reducing complex messages into these smooth one-liners. We put the poster to bed in December of 1986, and I decided that New York isn't as cold as Montreal, but people don't go, the streets aren't so active in New York until the spring, so we decided we were going to begin the wheat pasting campaign at the end of February, so by spring it would be visible enough that when people were exiting their apartments, they would be confronted. So we started repasting it in February of 1987, and in actual fact, it just ended up being a few weeks before the formation of ACT UP. We hoped that this poster would stimulate some kind of collective action. In fact, This poster was originally the first in a series of 3 that were eventually going to call for riots during the election in 1988. But ACT UP happened instead, so in a way, it was what I dreamed about, but it was far more than I hoped for. I want to talk a little bit about intellectual property at this point, and it will become clearer as I talk a little bit more about it. Once ACT UP had adopted it, an attorney who specialized in First Amendment issues advised me that if we didn't copyright the image, somebody else might and prevent us from using it. So I did, and then we gave the image to ACT UP. So we copyrighted it in order to give it away. I think that in the digital age, this conversation seems insanely quaint, but it was this was the strategic thinking behind it, and this is what we did. But I never prevented any use of it, not even by the anti-abortion group that appropriated it, because it was always meant to be a consciousness-raising project, and consciousness-raising is an ongoing, amorphic thing. You cannot control consciousness in the public sphere. You can only enter into it and then listen. Within the canon, however, silence equals death is freely referred to as the ACT UP logo, which is why I wanted to bring this background into it. That intones both ownership and intellectual property, but it wasn't designed, as I've already said to you, for ACT UP. It wasn't designed by ACT UP. It was never meant as a logo. It was an open source consciousness-raising project devised by a tiny collective a year before the fact of ACT UP. The framing of this image as a logo in order to explain the AIDS activist moment in shorthand effectively compacted the fuller dimensions of its creation and usage. And that's why I'm interested in having this conversation here, where people have an appetite for complexity. This gesture also folded ACT UP into the institutional framework it critiqued by referring to it as a branding exercise. And the tacit attribution of ACT UP's efficacy to branding is completely untrue. I was there. In the case of AIDS, agency existed without any marketing whatsoever. People were sliding through our fingers like sand. Nonetheless, the same sleight of hand that we use to project a sense of political inevitability outside of the queer community pantographed it to stakeholders within the community, within the activist community as well. And I think that today some of the, the conversations that Ryan alluded to are a continuation of those questions, which personally I find riveting. The socioanthropologist in me finds riveting. One of the stakeholders in the community was the curator for the new museum, Bill Olander, who decided after seeing the Silence Equals Death posters to offer the windows of the new museum to ACT UP. I organized the ACT UP committee that worked on that project, and out of it Gran Fury formed. So just to elaborate a little bit on this point, Bill called me and said, I would like to offer the new museum windows. At that time, it was on Lower Broadway, and Lower Broadway wasn't the shopping capital that it is now. There was no Prada store down the block. It was a very mixed-use, working-class area, and had the potential for actually frontage to a broad variety of communities, not unlike the space we'll be using tomorrow, actually, for our workshop. So I said to Bill, well, you understand that ACT UP is not an art collective? And he said, yes, I know. And I said, and you understand that if I offer the window to ACT UP, we will have no control over what happens. Are you okay with that? And he said, yeah, I am. And I said, and we can wheat paste this area around the museum to activate to bring the project out into the street. We can have demonstrations. We can do illegal things. You're okay with all of that? And he was like, yeah, okay. So it actually, this, which is referred to as, in the canon as Gran Fury's first work, was actually the work of an open collective within ACT UP that had not constituted itself as an art collective. There were anywhere from 20 to 50 people who worked on this window in this revolving doorway. But I think it's interesting to think of it that way. It became Gran Fury. We became Gran Fury. In his 1995 essay for But Is It Art, art historian Richard Meyer drew an elegant line between the John Hartfeld's 1928 poster, A Hand Has Five Fingers, and the Gran Fury poster, The Government Has Blood on Its Hands. His analysis situated the poster within the history of agitprop, favoring a historical reference to its political significance over an explanation of the political circumstances surrounding it. So I'd like to describe the specific political question that led to this poster so that maybe it will help us think about some of these larger issues. It does look like that poster, though. On July 19th, 1988, the New York City Commissioner of Health, Stephen Joseph, suddenly slashed the number of estimated AIDS cases in New York, a move that threatened to drastically reduce funding for AIDS services. The cut was purportedly based on cohort studies within San Francisco, with the San Francisco gay community, but the data was also rumored to have had a partial basis in a position paper from a right-wing think tank in DC that called into question the Kinsey report estimation of the number of gay citizens. Regardless of what the genesis of the cuts were, ACT UP New York declared war on him. The image on the right is from the 1968 French student revolts, the Molotov cocktail throwing image on the right. During a sit-in at Stephen Joseph's office, a copy of his itinerary was taken and it became the basis for a campaign spearheaded by an ACT UP affinity group. An affinity group is a small group of people who agree politically on what risks they're willing to take and how far they're willing to go. It's a way of acting politically in a way that feels comfortable. So this affinity group swiped his itinerary, and the pursuit of Stephen Joseph was so relentless, it created skirmishes between local news columnists over the legitimacy of protester calls to the commissioner's home, which led to a case squad visit to one activist's apartment by an NYPD police intelligence unit generally tasked with police slayings. The Village Voice reported Joseph as having been responsible for that investigation. We followed him everywhere. We showed up at lunch, we showed up at meetings, we showed up when he spoke, we showed up at his office, we went to his gym, we went to his house. It freaked the crap out of him. Several Gran Fury members were involved in the effort to remove Joseph from office, myself included. again, Gran Fury had begun to work, had decided to continue to do work as a collective, and had chosen the name Gran Fury, but it was still an open committee within ACT UP. Anyone could come to a Gran Fury meeting and work on something. So frequently, we subdivided work to areas of affinities. So we didn't all have to agree on something, which is what happened later when we closed the collective. I was involved in the campaign against Joseph, as were two or three other people in Gran Fury. So we produced the bloody handprint image as a poster to support this campaign. We made two versions, one aimed at then Mayor Ed Koch and one directed at Stephen Joseph, and the posters were wheat pasted around New York City by Gran Fury members and the general membership of ACT UP. To support the postering project, Gran Fury organized a small budget to bring buckets of red paint and rubber gloves to the floor of ACT UP to instigate a parallel graffiti campaign of bloody handprints that would go where the posters could not, and further reinforce the image's ubiquity. And Lower Manhattan was completely covered in bloody handprints during that period. It was actually my first date with my then partner, and it was very romantic. That same, although I will say, we thought we were being really slick, like giving people rubber gloves so that if the cops came, you just put the bucket down and take the glove off and then just walk away. But of course, what happens when you're like doing this is your entire leg is painted with red paint too. So we didn't think it through that well. And my boyfriend almost got popped, and it was our first fight too, now that I think of it. Because the way that I did a lot of legal support, so I was aware that if one of us was taken, if we were both taken, nobody would know we were there, so we should work on opposite sides of the street, so if the cops took one of us, the other one could follow them through the system. And the cops came after Phil, and I put down my bucket and watched, and I was going to go downtown with him if they took him, but they didn't. He talked his way out of it, but he thought I ditched him. Anyway, that same year, oh God, this is live streamed. That's what I was trying to say to you. That same year, ACT UP decided to target the regulatory agency responsible for the testing of potential AIDS therapies in the US, the Food and Drug Administration. Given the high and rapid mortality rate, it had become clear that any risks associated with the medications that the medications carried would not exceed the risks of non-intervention, and that the clinical trials for the safety and efficacy of these drugs were de facto health care for individuals confronting the fatal disease at that time. To unpack the complex questions at work, we wrote position papers and had to research the ACTG program. It was a lot of, Karen will attest to this, it was a lot of work. So to unpack the complex questions at work, in the decision to target the FDA, I thought that something iconographic would be useful because there were too many single things to say about it, that we needed some sort of an umbrella thing that would carry forward, and decided that the bloody hand would be the perfect candidate. So I proposed the nationalization of this image to Gran Fury, and we produced the larger version of this poster with the statistic 1 AIDS death every half hour, which we then changed to every 15 minutes when that was the statistic. We made sticker versions to replicate the same gesture of the graffiti handprints for people to do in areas where it would be too risky to do handprints. It was impactful, this poster, and the image was used over the following years to help articulate the ongoing AIDS activist struggle. However, in hindsight, I've come to think of this poster as the signal post for a turning point in the AIDS activist movement, the transition from critique to investiture. Many lives, of course, were saved as a result of the FDA action and our ongoing work with the drug approval process. But from a grassroots organizing perspective, a similar institutional mechanism to the one I was referring to earlier that subtly degrades the art of dissent caused AIDS activists to also simultaneously to become absorbed into the system that they were critiquing. I also consider it noteworthy the way that this poster has crystallized within the canon of AIDS agitprop, that the National Bloody Hand poster has come to represent an orchestrated campaign to expand access to life-saving AIDS medications and the efficacious deployment of collective direct action. Both of those things are, of course, true, and I'm not suggesting that we oughtn't to have done them. But in terms of an AIDS historiography, the fact that the national version of this poster has eclipsed the original versions is not without meaning in my estimation, and it somehow hobbles the point of studying the work, which again, from a political perspective, would be to gain strategic insights into this social movement. This image had its genesis in a local skirmish that has been jettisoned from this story because it makes no greater point. In my estimation, however, it was politically very significant. The pursuit of Stephen Joseph was no less pitched or potent than having taken on the FDA. This small sit-in at a local Department of Health office was instrumental in ACT UP New York's finding its voice, and it set the stage for an ongoing relationship with the commissioner that actually positively impacted the work we did for a pilot needle exchange program in New York City. Within this unwieldy story is also the tale of a community compelled by despair and the urgency of the moment, covered in red paint, and doggedly willing to risk arrest over and over again simply because it was the right thing to do. The Klieg light of the national media was not trained on this story, but ACT UP would not back down. As a result, a tiny affinity group powered by the solidarity of an only slightly larger collective of engaged individuals. ACT UP New York was a couple of hundred people. It wasn't thousands of people. This tiny affinity group took risks that set the stage for tensions between ACT UP New York and the police that led to ongoing surveillance of the organization and the political levy that accompanied that. I was going to have some pictures of the FBI files to illustrate this, but it seemed like a little bit of a reach. That is me on the right screaming my head off. These risks were also a contributing factor in the solidification of the reputation for resistance that enabled ACT UP New York to exert national influence over HIV/AIDS research protocols and the drug development pipeline. In fact, it might be a reach, but you could say that the Stephen Joseph saga may be part of the reason you have heard of the National Bloody Hand poster in the first place. So, although one came directly before the AIDS activist moment, both of these posters were born of a queer collectivity and were a reach for the queer commons. Both were deployed collectively within the public sphere during a... Okay, sorry. Both were deployed collectively within the public sphere during a political moment that was itself an experiment in queer collectivity. But the public sphere is a dialogue, and over time, the canon is what we have made of them. From their genesis, the institutional tellings of the story of AIDS activism that have absorbed or colonized them have modified the political meanings of these works, in my estimation, which is what I'm on about tonight. This framing not only impacted how stakeholders experienced them at that moment. When I pulled this slide up, it looks like it's 1945, right? It's so old. The framing not only impacted how stakeholders experienced it at that moment, it currently affects our attempts at an ethical AIDS historiography, the conversations that hopefully we'll have in the Q&A. But more critically, the ongoing struggles of people with HIV and their advocates. So here I would like to underscore several of my observations. I want to circle back. Silence Equals Death is not a logo. It's an amorphic consciousness-raising project, one that remains under construction. It was and still is the creation of those who respond to its call. But without the activist community that articulated its potential dimensions, I think it's important to consider that the poster might have come and gone in the night and you never would have heard of it. So I don't think that you can detach this work from this communal moment, this exercise in collectivity, in queer collectivity. Without that same community, Gran Fury's work, I believe, might have lacked its foundational clear-headedness. According to the canon, the power of this work is founded in its ability to communicate efficaciously within the public sphere, a practice that's, of course, bolstered by the cultural sleight of hand that is the appropriation of the authorized voice of advertising vernaculars of late-stage American capitalism. But it needs to be said that these appropriation strategies, in the absence of a community activating the shared spaces we view them in, is a presence without politic, potentially, and the work at least will function very differently. Absent a community, these strategies potentially become blunted critiques or academic critiques. Absent a community, the deployment of these strategies within the public sphere is closer to advertising itself. So different rules might apply, the rules of art rather than the rules of political resistance. And since art, in my estimation, that isn't about communication, is about class, political art in the public sphere needs to be sharpened with razor precision. It needs to do more than simply provoke. It also needs to be extremely clear. And now I hope that we'll have a very lively conversation. Do I get to see you now? Ah, there you are.
The instructions for the question.
Am I the roaming mic?
No, I'll take it on.
Perfect, okay. Is it on?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank everyone for being here. I think in the spirit of your talk, I think it's important that we take a moment to appreciate that we are all here and ready to speak with each other, that this is a communal moment, that it's under construction, and let's begin. Ian will walk around with a roaming mic to find your questions.
Raise your hand if you have a question.
whilst not belittling past achievements or present-day problems, what do you think ought to be done or can be done about the AIDS problem in Africa, which is the majority in the world today?
Well, here's what I would say about that. I believe that attention has been drawn to Africa, and I believe that all of the resources, the international resources that might be going other places as well, to other communities that are affected as well in this country and in America, are all being funneled into Africa. So I believe that the answer to that question is under formation. I also think that we have to keep a keen eye on, I was asked to participate in the UNODC and the UNAIDS campaign for zero new infections. I became very aware that there's a very complex thing that's happening there with regard to what we consider to be an end stage for the AIDS crisis, which is largely framed in terms of pharmaceutical interventions, but of course, as everyone who's an AIDS activist or everyone who's HIV positive or knows somebody who's HIV positive or has HIV knows that there are many more complex issues that are not addressed by pharmaceutical interventions. And I think as conscious activists and as members of the community at large, we have to be doing this and looking over here and taking the whole thing in.
It's maybe a small question, but the last poster we saw was silence equals sex, and I didn't get it. I don't get it, how we can pass from one thing to another thing. The first time I saw silence equals sex, I think people were sort of, ugh, no. Hey, you're hurting from 10, 20 years of something, and then, whoops, it's sex. It needs explanation. I don't know how you feel, but I need explanation.
Well, I think that this poster, I'm sorry, I didn't pivot and describe that poster, but that poster was done by Jordan Arsenal. And perhaps he can explain it, but I would like to offer some context first. It was a part of the post-virus 2012, is it? Yeah. And I think that, in a way, what I have to say about it is the silence equals death poster, if you did not see the version that had the small text across the bottom, and it didn't happen at a moment of AIDS activism that was embraced by major media corporations who then were telegraphing what the specifics were, and activists and demonstrations that also articulated it. Without that, all of those things surrounding it, you might have that same response to silence equals death. And in fact, as the lone media person of the Silence Equals Death project, before ACT UP came along, I tried to get Richard Goldstein, who was the lesbian and gay reporter at the Village Voice, and Lou Maletta, who was one of the first pioneers of gay cable network in New York City, and the bookstores to consider putting the poster up or writing about the piece, and they all had a very kind of flummoxed response to it without the activist community. They didn't know what it was, they didn't know what it meant, it was a big picture thing, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of clarity. I think it's very important in the public sphere to be clear, because my smell test for my work is if I show my poster to everyone in the New York City subway and they don't know what it's about, then the poster isn't good enough for me, for my objectives. Pivoting to Jordan's poster, he has 2 lines of text that situate what he's trying to say and that are beautifully written and very compelling and show a tremendous amount of political thought surrounding this question mark, which is, I will let you explain it, but I will, God, this is very paternal. I'm going to say what it means first. Basically, what the elevator pitch version is if you're HIV positive and you do not disclose that, you could probably get laid. But once you bring that up in a sexual situation, basta. But please, give a better explanation or read the text.
Thank you. I don't know I don't have the French translation off the top of my head, but the two lines of text are available both in Silence Equals Sex and Silence Égale Sex, and there's also an accompanying poem that was published and that I posted to my wall and my blogs about 3,000 times since it came out. I'd be happy to share. There's also now a video of a French version of the spoken piece that inspired the poster. Thanks to AIDS Action Now, because I don't know Photoshop, we were able to, well enough, we were able to do a remake of Silence Equals Death. It was about the criminalization of HIV puts HIV positive people in a catch-22 in which, as you said, disclosing their status means that they don't get sex, and shutting up about it means that they might. Hopefully we'll see, depends on what night it is, whatever. And that the final sentence is inform yourself and get laid. And so, contrary to what Avram is saying about clarity, my poster was situated to deliberately confuse. And the point was to get you to want to read the small text. And furthermore, it was a poster, instead of being geared primarily at a vast population alienated from their representative democracy, which is what 1980s America was, lol. It was aimed primarily at a pseudo-educated, pseudo-aware, pseudo-tolerant gay community in which I feel serophobia is rampant. And so I don't share the same need for clarity as Avram has, but thank you for letting me answer it.
I also I love this poster, which is why I put it there, but also to demonstrate the fact that consciousness raising is a very complex, ongoing thing. Politicization is a personal thing. One is never fully political. One is constantly being politicized. And what we have to challenge ourselves to do is to each take the next step for us, whatever that happens to be. So in terms of, again, the AIDS historiography, which I did not go on about this in my talk, but at the moment we were making this work, I was very conscious that the historiography was beginning. Culture makers, journalists, people in the arts community shifted to the edges of their seats and became engaged and started talking about it. So in a way, we were articulating a thing that other people were not able to say or had not said yet, and threw their hat in the ring. But that throwing of the hat in the ring without the radical politic or being multifactorial, being multilevular in its political scope, creates the feeling that something is being done about this terrible thing. You're reading about it, you're seeing it, it's being circulated within academia now, there are movies about it, there have been many exhibitions about it. It gives the impression, it gave the impression then, the exact same impression that it gives now, that it was being resolved. media tropes are storytelling, and stories have beginnings and middles and ends. And as a lifelong activist, I knew from the second that the New York Times covered an ACT UP meeting, and we were on the first page of the B section, that somebody somewhere very soon would be writing the rest of that story arc, the birth of a movement, the problems with the movement, the decline or the burnout, and then some version, some resolved denouement. So I think that I was very conscious of that then, and as a result, within Gran Fury, I didn't go to any of the installations that we were invited to do. I didn't do any public speaking at the time. I didn't want to divert any money, even though I knew that cultural money was not going to save people's lives. I didn't want to participate in that machinery at that time, and it's very hard to impress how dramatic it was. People were literally dying sometimes in the street. So I ethically resisted it at that moment, and I'm not even remotely surprised to hear a conversation about what an AIDS historiography means or does now, because it was doing it from the beginning. It's how institutional frameworks work.
Thank you for your talk. So this is sort of building off questions around the criminalization of HIV and consciousness raising around that. And it's sort of more, it's a bit tangential from that about the sort of use of protecting gays and lesbians and trans people from bashers as like the pretext for social cleansing in neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And so this is like, it's sort of an old story, and it's been happening in a lot of neighborhoods in New York, in San Francisco, and here. And you know, it always sort of depends on this narrative of attacks on gays are on the rise. They've always been on the rise since, you know, forever, even if the statistics don't bear them out. And then, you know, sort of any sort of confrontation between rich gays and poor people within a neighborhood gets framed as homophobic. And as a homophobic attack. There was sort of a very famous incident in Montreal in 2012, I believe, where the vice president of Pride Montreal, coming home from some fancy party, went up to a homeless woman who was sitting in a square where a lot of homeless people hang out, and told her to be quiet because she was being too loud, and she punched him in the face. And then this got framed as a part of the wave of anti-gay attacks. Anyway, I was interested in what your thoughts are on possible consciousness-raising strategies around that, because people, in addition to sort of the campaigns, the sort of pro-policing campaigns that have been going on, I Love My Village and Pink Square and these sorts of things that have been happening, there have been some sort of counter-campaigns of postering, but I was interested in what you would think about strategies for clarity around issues like that.
Yeah, I think that this is a really complex, ongoing question, as you've said. It's always been true, and here again, you know, because on television in the U.S., which is a television state practically, you can see gay characters and lesbian characters and occasionally trans characters with some regularity on nightly television. It creates this cushion effect, this idea that things are actually okay. But of course, anyone who is queer and experiences daily life knows that homophobia exists. It always has, and it always will, and it still does, and that makes it even harder to root out. As a Jew, I'm also constantly having to reevaluate my own politic about anti-Semitism, and I have a name that's pretty fucking Jewish. I mean, I live in New York City in the 21st century, and I can't tell you how often when people ask me my name and I tell them, they say, no, come on, really, what's your name? So I think that the insidiousness of these kinds of social traps, homophobia, anti-Semitism, all of it, are an ongoing consciousness-raising project as well. And I'm a big believer in I'm the try-everything dude. And the last fight I ever had with my dad, who was a party member, I mean, he was like this kind of lefty who, because there was no actual revolution in America, thought that nothing could change, and it just wasn't worth trying because capitalism is so institutionally rooted in every single thing that we say, do, think, and see that it's impossible to stimulate radical responses. But the screaming fight that I had with him, I was like, look, old man, I have two choices. I can do nothing, and I know what will happen. People will continue to die. Or I can try something, and if it doesn't work, I will try something else, and if that doesn't work, I will try something else. So I'm the try something else dude, and I would say every action from the tiniest, most singular action to the most public action are all valid, because again, 6 people did Silence Equals Death before ACT UP came along. We didn't know what would happen, and I was prepared to instigate riots. I didn't know where it was heading, but we did not start this movement, but I'm just saying that you can never, collective responses are so potent, but the ways in which we think about them are also fed to us institutionally, and you can never remove or strip the power of the individual voice out of that. A community is made up of individuals, so I would say that I would do everything, and I have. I mean, I've formed so many queer collectives to talk about homophobia for decades. You've seen the stuff under my bed, and none of it's worked, but I'm not going to sleep through the night until it's just a life's work, right? Isn't that the answer to the question?
I really appreciated hearing you talk about Silence Equals Death and the Silence Equals Death Collective, because I've always read that next to it, and of course I never knew what the collective was. So it's interesting to know about the 6 people. And also then to hear what happened with Gran Fury and ACT UP, and when you spoke about the installation at the new museum, and you said sort of 20 to 50, I picture it as this amorphous kind of group of people coming together. Tied into the general ideas behind your talk about the importance of collective, grassroots, organizing groups working together. So my question is, what happened with Gran Fury? Because you mentioned that at a certain point it became closed. So I'd love to know more about how and why and when that happened, and what was the impetus for that?
Sure. The open door way of working became impossible for us because as an open collective, anyone could show up to a Gran Fury meeting. It was announced in a circular. At every ACT UP meeting, they gave out a thing on the table in the back of the room that said where every meeting was. And anyone could come to it, and what would happen would be what we were doing was doing a fair amount of demonstration posters, so we had discrete dates that things had to be done by. And at one meeting, whoever the population of that meeting was would agree on something, and in the next meeting, 5 of those people would not show up, and 6 more people would, and the conversation had to be had again. So we became aware that we weren't able to work that way, and how we ended up working as a collective was, as I pointed out with these couple of posters, very balkanized. So I worked on the Read My Lips somebody else worked on the AIDS in Prison poster, I worked on the Bloody Hands, and we were actually subdivided. It wasn't a true collective. So we decided that it was kind of like a storage house of ideas, that we decided we would experiment with closing it, although we didn't feel completely comfortable doing it, and that we would close it, and at the beginning of the conversations of closure, that would be the discrete group as it was, and we would stop announcing meetings, so we would start meeting on the side, basically. And we always had it in our head that that once we figured out how to work as a collective, we would then open it back up. So that was what happened with Gran Fury. In terms of why Gran Fury stopped working, there were, again, it's a collective. The core of it ended up being around 11 people. There were a couple of ideas about why that happened. I can only tell you mine. There were members of the collective who felt like the issues in the AIDS crisis were becoming too complex for us to reduce into these sort of terse one-liners. And we were beginning to explore the possibilities of doing comic books that have very intricate safe sex stories, or we worked with prostitutes of New York, we worked with Guerrilla Girls, we tried collaborating with community-based organizations. Many of those projects were failures, or we could never bring to fruition for reasons of collectivity and how complicated it can be. So some members in Gran Fury decided that the issues were too complex. We weren't really the right people to do it. There were community-based organizations who could do those things better than we could, and that we should fold tent and do like Greta Garbo and like go out on a high. But my personal version of that story is that the issues surrounding AIDS were always complex. There were members of Gran Fury who were politicized in different ways and at different levels. And as some members became aware of how complex they were, they lost their nerve. That's my version of that story. So what happened was the collective did continue to work together, but half of it spun off. And there were a handful of members who went on to do 2 or 3 other projects, one of which is the Gran Fury forQuestions poster, which I consider to be one of our most powerful pieces, but it was, if you've ever seen that poster or have a chance to see it, the Gran Fury signature is literally this small, because it's a gesture at the partialness of the collectivity. But as a consequence, it's a poster that is incredibly raw and emotional, and exactly proved that it's possible to talk about things that are powerful without having to be reductive. There are other things to say, and I would argue, as I argued then to the other members of the collective, and I argue all the time now, I can think of 1 million things to say about AIDS. I can think of at least 1 million things to say about it, and as we know, it's in no danger of going away in any way that I am comfortable with. So that's my version of that story.
I was fascinated to hear you talk about the drafts of the posters, the failures, some projects work, some don't. And in light of all that, those are really interesting choices, especially in terms of the collective energy. And I wondered if you could talk about personal and public archives in relation to both ACT UP and Gran Fury and your own work.
Well, that's a fairly big topic. I as you know, because you've had Sarah and Jim up here to speak in the past, and they've done this amazing thing with the ACT UP Oral History Project, which is very comprehensive. But what it does not do, for some reason, is actually talk about the agitprop. There's no parallel project for this canon. And I feel like that's what's needed, is to, Ian was at my apartment a couple of weeks ago, and I dragged out all this stuff, and it's like, to see like how many members these collectives shared, like work that you have seen but don't know that 3 people from this collective were also in that collective, or were former Gran Fury members, or the Silence Equals Death project, 2 of the people the person I invited into the collective was the close friend of my boyfriend Don, who died, and the person who was the genesis behind the formation of Gran Fury out of the new museum window was a friend of ours in the same circle of friends, and he also knew Don, and he and his boyfriend gave Don a job when he was too sick to work. And so I think knowing that is enlightening. So I sort of, what I was saying, I'm digressing. What I was saying to Ian was, there was this Robert Frank documentary that I once saw, where he basically flipped through a journal with the camera pointing at it and talked about every picture in it. That's what I think one would need to have, and that it would need to be completely comprehensive. It needs to be multiple archives. And when Helen Molesworth was doing the show for Harvard, she said that it turns out that I have a very large archive that's still in private hands. A lot of it's already been sort of placed, and once things are placed into institutional archives, you then have to deal with all of the questions of access and, working together to explore the material. And I don't know, as an academician, what I would do if I had to go to Harvard and to NYU and to, I don't know what that experience is like, how you build an ethical historiography when it's so balkanized and so deeply institutionalized, and the material, everyone has to publish, and the material, there are fiefdoms. And so I would sort of move for some sort of a communal version of this storytelling. That would be my solution. It's a pretty big room if you have to run around with a microphone, right?
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about the city. One of the things I remember studying art in the late 80s and early 90s and hearing bit by bit about ACT UP and Gran Fury and seeing some of the photographs and then getting, but is it art? It's how small the pictures were of such a big project. And hearing you talk tonight and seeing these images again, we see at the most maybe a few hundred posters, but there were thousands of posters. And we see maybe 20 hands, but it sounds like there were thousands of hands. What's remarkable to me is the numbers. There are 200, you say, maybe ACT UP, maybe 300. Some of these projects in the city were 10 people. And I'm wondering if, in addition to stories around kinship and thinking about considerations of ethics, which I agree are really important when thinking about historiography, if this story can be told through the space of the city, and if you've reflected on that.
I have, actually. It was Sarah Schulman and I at the Harvard conference both realized that we felt very compelled by the idea that there was no AIDS memorial, which is, of course, fraught as a conversation. What would it be? What does it memorialize? Is AIDS over? It raises more questions than it solves, but as I was thinking about that, all of the attendant problems, I started to realize that the only kind of AIDS memorial that would be ethical would be multi-site, multi-city, like a scavenger hunt, that you couldn't know this story without going many places. So I completely agree with your gesture. I also think that I'm going to draw back to the idea of individual agency. The Gran Fury piece, The New York Crimes, which you may or may not have seen, but we replicated the New York Times front and back cover. The front was news, the back cover was a fake pharmaceutical ad, and inside were articles and an op-ed page. And we went to all of the committees in ACT UP that were working on IV drug use, women and AIDS, AIDS in the prison system, the pharmaceutical industrial complex. The articles that we wished people were able to see about what was happening. And we decided to make our own newspaper. The idea actually came to me, I was at the Museum of Modern Art Library with my mother at the Fluxus show, and on one of the lists it says, of the many things to do, it said, make a paper and pass it out on the corner as if it were real. And so I went to Gran Fury and I said, why don't we do that? So we did, and that is that project. And to view it again as in the canon or in a vitrine, it has absolutely no meaning because you don't know how many people worked on that piece, on the text, and how many people who worked on that text were members of a committee that involved 20 to 30 people that did everything from meeting with people to doing sit-ins to breaking into offices and fucking with files. The amount of time that it took for these ongoing campaigns and investigations and the research that went into it, you would never know that seeing this thing. And the other thing that you would not know, which is the most important thing in my estimation in terms of activism, the public sphere, individual agency, late stage American capitalism, all of it, was at the time in New York City, you could buy the New York Times at vending machines on the corners, and they were prolific. I mean, there were lots of them. And it was by the honor system, you put in a quarter, it opened, you took out one paper, you closed the thing. And so we sent out teams of people, my affinity group, people in Gran Fury, I think another affinity group worked over those. There were maybe 20 or 30 people tops, with rolls of quarters. It's $10 for a roll of quarters, like maybe for $50, 20 or 30 people. We did a logistics check to see when the New York Times took yesterday's papers and put the new ones in and followed them around so they wouldn't be taking our paper out. And in teams with lookouts and rolls of quarters, we would open the thing, take out all the papers, remove all of their front and back and editorial pages, put ours, wrap their paper in ours, and put them all back into the vending machine. So for $50, 20 people usurped the New York Times for that day. Now, what you will never know or hear is what it meant to the people who read it, whether they thought it was real or not. If they just threw it out or if they read it and learned something, we don't know that. But you know what? I don't think it's important to know that, because the risk or the work, it was very labor intensive, I'm not going to lie, but it was so well worth the experiment. And knowing that I wouldn't know what happened to it, I still think that it was worth it. And when I tell that piece of the story to people who have never considered the simplest gesture, what a simplest gesture can do in terms of your participation in the world, I see eyes lighting up when they hear that story. So I consider that, I consider the doing, I consider the collectivity in the most invisible ways and in the broadest ways to be so essential to an engaged life that I believe in all of it. I believe in the invisible stuff, and I think we get so sort of trapped in that this is part of the trauma of canon, is that it implies or it intones that once work is efficacious enough, it becomes great, and then we get to study it, but you're only studying pieces of it, and that's what I'm trying to like break that apart a little bit here so that you can begin to think about your work and not get caught in the trap of it having to be official or it having to be institutional or it having to be great. It is meaningful regardless.
Hi.
Thank you.
So you're talking about how there was this threat that the poster could have just disappeared overnight had there not been the activist community around it to sort of carry it forward. But also how when you started, there was a disparate shared experience but no political response. Can you speak to what facilitated that change from the disparate shared experience to the organized political community in that period?
I think that I think what you're asking about is I think you're asking me to describe a zeitgeist, and again, I will try to do that, but I feel it necessary to say that I didn't care whether there was a zeitgeist. That wasn't why we did the poster. I wanted to instigate riots. That was what the intention was. We were acting anonymously as a collective for that reason. And it changed because in the process of saying one thing, and we're going to be talking about this a lot tomorrow at this workshop. The public sphere is a dialogue. It's about listening. And that is what capital is about. It's about following the money, but I'm talking politically about following the ideas so that you float something and it doesn't work and you listen to the response. We used to go around with cameras and photograph the homophobic graffiti on our posters and study them. So that because it's one thing to be told what in institutionalized media in America, they tell us what we think. And I forget who I was having this conversation with today. The conversation about media relevancy. We're told that you have to, the public sphere is virtual now, and you need to communicate with social media. But who's telling us that? You have to always be looking at who's telling you that. So the media is telling you that social media is media relevancy. Well, what do we make of that piece of information? Like, is that actually true? I would say, yes, it's partly true, because there are many people who will not think critically and will just go ahead and only use those avenues. But then those people, guess what, go to the dry cleaner or go to the grocery store, and if your poster or whatever it is you need to say confronts them on that street, it's totally different from it being virtual. It's actual, it's visceral. So I would say that I think it's a straw man to think in terms of, to be cowed by the idea that we're not in a moment, because we're always in a moment.
I don't know if I have a question or an observation. Maybe I'd just like to get your response to it. But first of all, didn't know who you were really until tonight, but the work that you did...
I didn't either.
Had a profound impact on me as a young gay man in Winnipeg in the 80s. You have no idea. Anyway, I mean, and because it was a very small, very homophobic, very closeted community, and it made it possible for me to come out in a time and then to get active around AIDS issues. It was remarkable, so thank you. But my question is, you mentioned the pharmaceutical industrial complex, and I think objectively, maybe, what's keeping people with HIV alive now is the capitalist pharmaceutical industrial complex. And I wonder if you have a reaction to that, or if you'd like to talk about it.
I do. It's, and thank you for asking that question. It's an obsession of mine. I believe that it's possible to take advantage of capitalism and critique it at the same time. In fact, I think it's our responsibility to do that. So I think I need to be clear about not having one mistakenly understand what I'm saying as a wish that it didn't exist. It has kept many, many people alive. Of course it should exist. But the truth is, it doesn't really matter whether I think it should exist. It exists anyway because it's a big money-making thing. So the reason why I feel it's important to constantly remind ourselves of that is that it's a big money-making thing. And on the one hand, we got what we needed, but can we really say that protease inhibitors would never have been developed or come to the market if we hadn't fast-tracked them? I think it's highly dubious that if there was something efficacious that could be proven, that it wouldn't come to the market anyway. So on the one hand, it's a part of our historiography, but on another hand, it's an illusion that because of this parallel moment, it's an illusion that it might not have happened without us. Also, I think that the reason why I'm so obsessed with these questions has so much to do with prevention models and PrEP and PEP and HARD, and the way that when I was talking to Alex for Fuse, Alex McLeland for Fuse magazine, we talked about this a little bit. On the one hand, these medications are making it possible for us to change the way in which we think about our sexual self-determination and our behavior. But on the other hand, we're driving people into the marketplace for drugs. And again, I would never in a million years say I don't think PrEP or PEP should exist. I think everyone should have access to it. It should be easy to get. It should be one of the many arrows in our quiver. But it also doesn't stop, you can't stop short of saying it will cost you $2,000 a month unless you have insurance, but they may not cover it. You might feel like you've been thrown out of a moving plane taking it. I did. That it will change your physiology. It is not exactly chemotherapy, but it's kind of chemotherapy. And what does it mean to have a pharmaceutical intervention replace all of the other complex questions surrounding HIV that have to do with homophobia and scapegoating, the prison industrial complex? What difference does it make if you can take a post-exposure prophylaxis if your partner, who you have zero viral load, or if you're taking PrEP and you have undetectable viral load? What does it mean to be able to make that decision and still have your partner, who you did disclose your HIV status to, who you had zero viral load, they did not seroconvert, you don't have AIDS, they don't have AIDS, but they could still accuse you in the court of law in America. I don't know what it's like here, but there are people in prison right now in that situation. So on the one hand, great thing, and yes, feel totally great about it, but we also need to understand that the dividing line between the sick and the well is the issue, and there's only one AIDS therapy that I'm interested in, and it's a universal cure for everyone, because without it, all of those other things still exist. So I would say ecstatic and what's the word I'm looking for? Not cautious, conscious. I think we really have to be conscious about every single thing that we say and do and what the meaning of these things are, because they're not without, these things are not without meaning.
We have one more question.
Okay, cool, got it. First of all, thank you very much for coming and speaking.
Thank you.
It's been very good. When you start to talk, when you start to solidify the history of the AIDS epidemic, it's worth considering that history in itself, like as we learn it, as people at large learn it, is constantly manipulated by those in power who fear the dissent that may be a more honest portrayal, not sugar-coated, not sensationalized, but just cut and dry facts, the kind of dissent that might trigger. And do you think in this day and age, when we have this huge resource at our fingertips, the internet, where it's definitely, I find, very easy to get alternative information than what you see on TV and what you see in newspapers and kind of what you see discussed. That sort of system of pacifying common conceptions to fit an agenda is more threatened than it might have been in the past.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and it's one of the reasons I never say no to an opportunity to have conversations like this with people like you, because it's really essential that we circumnavigate the channels of a historiography so that we can deploy the resources that are there, that they don't want us to know about. And I also, it has this, because I do speak a fair amount, I have a very different view of the world than a lot of my contemporaries do, and this intergenerational question mark, which is worth a conversation. When speaking with my peers, there's a ton of hand-wringing about younger people aren't engaged, it's not a political moment, what are they doing? And I have a completely different set of responses, because I'm in this room hearing probative conversations and comments like the ones that you just made that are fully conscious, and I feel incredibly hopeful that in the internet age, with people who are fully conscious now, that the world has the potential to change. I'm very sanguine about what those young people are doing. I don't have that thing for some reason, because I'm here and I'm seeing it and I'm hearing it, and more to the point, teaching is actually learning, so I'm expanding my way of seeing the world in the process as well. So thank you for that comment.
I think we'll wrap up now. Thank you, Avram, for making things both complicated and hopeful at the same time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And there's just a couple final thank yous to Vive Healthcare, to the Office of the President at Concordia University, to Johnny Forever for the beautiful poster art, to
the poster.
The
I love
poster.
that poster.
Yeah. To the teaching team of the HIV/AIDS course at Concordia University, Karen Herland, Gilbert Hermant, the teaching assistants, Alex McClellan and Greg Rodriguez, the internship coordinator, Caitlin Zazula, Karen Herland, director of the HIV/AIDS lecture series, Ian Bradley Perrin, the HIV/AIDS community lecture series coordinator. And for more information of the HIV/AIDS project and community lecture series, you can visit the website aids.concordia.ca, find us on Facebook and Twitter. And thank you for attending the first lecture of 2014, and be sure to attend our next lecture, March 20th, 7 p.m., Leacock Building at McGill campus. We'll be hosting the legal scholar and thinker Aziza Ahmed in partnership with the McGill Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. Have a good evening, everybody.